What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking classic death metal debut albums. Alright, let's dive right in, and these are being ranked kind of in terms of uniqueness, their legacy, and also my own personal enjoyment, and we're going to start with Carcass. Now, probably an unpopular opinion right from the beginning, but it's my own personal preference. This is kind of, Reek of Putrefaction is sort of bottom for me. I really don't enjoy listening to this album. I hate the mix. Even Bill Steer hates the mix on this thing. He doesn't like how it sounds, and it's just not an enjoyable album for me to listen to in comparison to a lot of these other ones. Now, mind you, too, that even though these tiers still have their standard names, that doesn't mean I'd give this album a D if I were, like, reviewing it on its own. It just means it's one of the lowest in terms of the ones that I'd want to listen to. Cannibal Corpse Eaten Back to Life, on the other hand, I quite enjoy this album, and I think it's a very important album for the genre. It's a very formative one in terms of kind of like pushing the genre, building the blueprint. I'm going to put this one at A tier, not quite at S tier. Cannibal Corpse have better albums than this, obviously, but as far as out of this bunch, I would rank them up there. Then we have Autopsy with Severed Survival, and this is another one I don't really enjoy. I talked about in my just death metal bands tier list. I'm not a big Autopsy fan. They use a lot of doom elements, and I'm just not a doom guy, so that drags it down a bit for me. And also, just in particular, their debut, like, I love the cover art, but it's just not an album that does a whole lot for me personally. So I could see why a lot of people would have this really high, even at S tier, but for me, it's down at the bottom. Then we have Obituary with Slowly We Rot, and this is actually probably one of my favorite Obituary albums. It's pretty solid. I wouldn't necessarily rank it like super duper high on here, maybe a little bit higher than some of these other ones, but it's pretty good. You know, actually, I'm going to put it at A tier, even though I was, you know, a little bit hard on Obituary during my death metal bands tier list. This album, I think, is really solid. I think it's a formative death metal album, and I can see why a lot of people would enjoy it and bring it up quite a bit. So I'm going to put it right alongside Cannibal Corpse there. All right, Entombed, Left Hand Path. This is an absolute classic. I'm going to throw it up at S tier. Hopefully redeeming myself a little bit for how low I put Entombed as a band on the other tier list, but I raved about this album there. Like, this is just so good. From just the performances to the atmosphere, like the production for its time is just so far ahead a lot of these other albums, and it's just an album that just like surrounds you and like puts you in this like cavernous place, and I love it. All right, Dying Fetus, Purification Through Violence. Like this album, it's not one of my favorite Dying Fetus albums. I think they get better from here, and so if we had some of the later stuff, I think it would be higher. I'm going to put this at B tier. It's a strong album. I don't think it's as strong as, say, Eaten Back to Life, but it's a good one. It's a formative one, and Dying Fetus, like, you almost can't go wrong with a lot of their stuff. But yeah, I think right in the middle feels about right for that one. All right, Nile Amongst the Catacombs, on the other hand, I'm going to put that at S tier, mostly because of uniqueness. Like, and also it's just very strong. I love listening to this album. It's super heavy. It has unmatched atmosphere that even rivals Left Hand Path, but it's also unique kind of atmosphere because it's got that more regional kind of Egyptian sort of mythology behind it. Very impressive album right out of the gate, and just Nile just almost in a league of their own in terms of what they were doing and sort of what they're still doing. Bolt Thrower and Battle There Is No Law. Of the Bolt Thrower albums, I actually like the debut pretty high up. I would rank it pretty high. I love just how like heavy and ridiculous it is. It just sounds so like cacophonous and just intense and crazy. I'm going to put it at B tier. I don't have a ton to say about it, but I like it quite a bit more than some of these other ones, but not as much as my top picks. Gorguts, Considered Dead. Now, this is another band where I wish that one of their other albums was on here, because frankly, their debut is a pretty standard death metal album where they're just doing basically what everybody else is doing, and there's nothing particularly special about it. They hadn't fully formed Voltron yet, if you will. They hadn't really become Gorguts. So I'm going to put this one at C tier. Again, if we're talking about them as a band, though, I rank them much higher. Death, Scream, Bloody Gore, gotta be S tier, obviously. Like, there's no question about that. Just a fantastic blueprint death metal album that inspired so many others, and it still holds up. It's one of my favorites to listen to out of their entire discography, even though it's not maybe as complex or interesting overall as some of their later albums. All right, then Deicide with Deicide, and I mentioned in my other tier list that I quite enjoy their full discography. Actually had fun really diving into that, but their debut is another one that I would rank pretty high up there. I don't think it's their best, but out of the group here of debuts, I would enjoy listening to it well above a bunch of these. So I'm going to put it at A tier, not quite at S, and just a really strong outing, fun album to listen to. All right, Suffocation with Effigy of the Forgotten. I mentioned that I'm not a big Suffocation fan. I think that they're kind of a lower tier band out of these. This album is just okay. It's definitely not the worst. I think it's one of Suffocation's better albums out of their full discography, probably, but I'm still just going to put it at C tier in terms of the options available here. It's just all right. Morbid Angel, Altars of Madness. This will be maybe half redemption, half still making people mad about this, because I ranked Morbid Angel as a band pretty low, but obviously this album needs to be pretty high. One of the original death metal albums, if you want to call it that. Very influential. I don't enjoy listening to it though as much as my S tier albums though. I'm still going to put it at A, because in terms of legacy alone, it deserves that. And there's some unique things about its atmosphere and what it's doing. But I still I don't love this album like some people do. So I'm going to put it at A tier. And hopefully that'll appease people enough. But I know some people are going to be super mad that that's not an S tier. But you know what? Make your own tier list then. Then we have Possessed with 7 Churches. And really fun album. Consistent but short discography. All the albums kind of rank about the same for me. I'm going to put this one at B tier. Very important death metal album. I don't think it's as unique or special or just fun to listen to as some of these others, but just a really solid, slightly above mid-tier death metal album that's a good time. 6 Feet Under, Haunted. You all should know by now I'm not a 6 Feet Under fan. This is going to go at the bottom for me. I guess as far as 6 Feet Under albums go, you could argue that this is maybe their best, but that's, that bar is so low that that's not really saying much for me. Then we have Atheist, and this should be Piece of Time, but I realized I actually grabbed the wrong album art, so oops. But just pretend that that's Piece of Time. I mentioned this in my other list. Atheist just coming right out of the gate, dropping something way ahead of its time in terms of the progressiveness and the complexity of the compositions, despite when it was coming out. I'm going to put that at S tier. Then we have Vader with the Ultimate Incantation. Now, as much as I love Vader's discography, I'm not a huge fan of their debut. It's just kind of a C tier album for me. They get better from there. I think the album right after this one, the next few after this one, really step things up. This one, it's just okay. It's sort of standard fare, but Vader have much better albums than this one. Cryptopsy with Blasphemy Made Flesh. Enjoy this album. Again, another band, I think they have better albums, but they came pretty strong out of the gate. And another album that's just unmatched in its ferocity. This thing is just it leaves craters. It sounds apocalyptic, both in terms of the instrumentation and the production that they chose. I'm going to put it at B tier. Not quite as high up here as some of these other ones, but a really strong debut nonetheless. Immolation with Dawn of Possession. Really enjoy the Immolation discography, but personally, and this may be another hot take, I'm not a fan of the debut. I find it to be kind of a very paint-by-numbers death metal album, and they only improve from there. So I'm going to actually put it in D as well. Again, these are not D-graded albums. They're just my least favorites of this particular bunch. Incantation, Onwards to Golgotha. So an interesting one here, because I mentioned I'm not an Incantation fan, and I'm more of an Immolation fan, but as far as their debuts go, I think that this debut is stronger than theirs. I'm going to put this one at C tier. Still not in love with it, but the atmosphere is stronger. Their sound is a little bit more unique. I mentioned I feel like they do what they do so well, and they did so right from the beginning in terms of just this very, doomy, but also technical and very ferocious kind of sound. And then we have Pestilence with Malleus Maleficarum. That's a mouthful to say. And I was pleasantly surprised with this one. Really pretty solid right out of the gate, again, in terms of the performance, doing something different, keeping things engaging. I want to put this one at B tier, And again, I'm going to just shout out to Mad Mike. Check out his discography tier list for Pestilence, because you cannot not laugh with the take that he took with that one.
First, we have Malleus Maleficarum, whatever the fuck.
But y'all let me know down in the comments. It's your turn. How would you rank these albums? Which ones would you rank higher or lower, and why? Check out this playlist for plenty more death metal tier lists and just metal tier lists in general, and subscribe if you're new here. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.